Jackie, come here. Jackie? Sorry.
No worries. Good morning, Commissioner Willie.
Morning.
Right, so is 8:30, Madam Chair. We are just waiting for Commissioner Rogers, and you have your other colleagues here with you.
Commissioner Willie, are you ready to go?
I am. I was looking at my calendar and I have to go off of Zoom to look at my calendar.
Oh, okay. No worries. Okay, well then. Good morning and welcome everyone to the March 9th, 2021 Washington County Board of Commissioners work session. This is Chair Catherine Harrington. I'm joined by Commissioners Pam Treese, Commissioner Nafisa Faye, and Commissioner Jerry Willie. We're anticipating Commissioner Roy Rogers will join us shortly. We have a very full agenda that staff has gifted us with 11 items. So we're just going to dive right into it. First, board and leadership communication. Who would like to go first?
I can go first.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'll be brief. And I think last week we had our roundtable, so I don't really have much to report for last week.
Well, I want to thank you all for spending that time together last week. Between our Tuesday meeting and our roundtable on Thursday, we had 11 hours together. I know for myself, I also participated in the WCVA CEO semifinalist interviews, so that ate up another 12 hours of the week. So for me, it was a very intensive listening week. And then we had the town hall. So thank you for participating in that. I asked Elizabeth if there would be a short summary so we know what the general numbers were. I noticed the Zoom participants level went up to about 30, just over 30. And apparently we had just over 100 people who viewed it on the YouTube streaming video channel as well. I don't know if staff has the ability to detect how many folks utilize the Spanish translation channel either, but I thought it was fun. I hope you had a good time too. You all did a great job. So yeah, last week was a busy week.
Yeah.
Since I jumped in, I'll just round it out. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it was my first town hall, so I certainly enjoyed it, the questions and the experience.
Well, it was a first town hall for all of us because it really was our first town hall. We'd had two COVID town halls last year, but this was our first general one. So yeah, off to a good start. Yesterday was the AOC Legislative Steering Committee Day, Legislative Committee, and Board of Directors. Just wanted to let you know, in general, AOC is moving forward on a building purchase. The executive team has made the decision to invest in a commercial appraisal market assessment and looking at getting that done by late April. And so the next steps will go through the board of directors after that. It was a pretty intense set of meetings yesterday. There was some discussion on in the Public Safety Committee about a bill that hadn't been noted on the agenda. And so when it came to the legislative committee and then up to the board, well, in the legislative committee, there was a lot of discussion and the minority report mechanism that had been put in place for splits was not highlighted because folks didn't know that the particular gun bill that was of note was even going to be discussed at the committee. So caught a lot of people off guard. So there was quite a bit of overlap into the board of directors meeting from that. So hopefully we'll continue to work through that. My concern is that I wasn't able to attend the Public Safety Committee meeting myself yesterday because of another conflict. I will be able to attend the April meeting, but then it looks like there are some Metro Supportive Housing Services meetings that conflict with the May 10th meeting. So I think we'll need to stay tuned on that front, particularly as there are some controversial bills, but also the community corrections funding is a big one for us. Other than that, I've got another 8 hours of WCBA CEO final interviews this week. And I look forward to having that done. So that's it for me. How about from the rest of you?
I'll go ahead of Commissioner Teresa and Rogers there. It was the town hall for me that on Saturday was enjoyable, I think, and the feedback we got from the Tualatin River Keepers on a particular landing that we need to. There's some attention that needs to be paid to. I appreciate their reaching out for that. That was good because I didn't even know that was there. So that was always good to hear about. Yesterday, we went through our phishing test for with IT to make sure that we don't click on the wrong attachments and those kinds of things. That's always really, really educational. The bad guys are very clever, and it would be easy to get snared into some of those things. So that's always good to have that education. And there's another email this morning where we can actually log in and take some more, get some more information on that. So I'll be doing that over the next few days, just because it's really good information. Later this week, I have COLPAC and I have Northwest Act, both on all day Thursdays, and then an LUT update, of course, Thursday afternoon. So that'll do it for me for this week. So yeah, it's busy times.
Commissioner Teresa or Commissioner Rogers?
I can go next. Just like everybody else, it was a busy week with all of the county events that we participated in, and I too attended the cyber training yesterday. It was well done. It took a full hour, and we needed a full hour, so I appreciated it. Tonight is the Public Health Advisory Committee meeting. And on that agenda is the county syringe exchange program, kind of an update on vaccine rollout and budget planning and what's coming up in the legislative session. So I'll be attending that. I do have a conflict tonight with Community Action Organization is having their meeting. They moved their date, and it always makes it a challenge. So I'm working with Megan to figure out what key points I need to make sure I'm getting for both of those. The other thing I wanted to mention to my fellow commissioners is that I'm going to be testifying personally on HB 2510. This is the safe gun storage bill, which is different than the bill that the chair talked about. That is concealed weapons in a public space, I believe, and this is about safe gun storage. So I'll be testifying there, and I've talked to Judge Eat briefly about this, and apparently this is we supported a very similar bill as a commission in the last session. So just out of courtesy, I wanted to let everyone know what I'm doing there. Okay, that's it for me.
Thank you. Anything you'd like to add or share, Commissioner Rogers?
No, thank you.
Okay, all righty. Then we'll turn to leadership communication. Ms. Angie.
Good morning, Chair Harrington, Board of Commissioners. Clerk Moss, if you can promote Matt Craigie. I'm really pleased today to introduce Matt Craigie. I was happy to actually be in the office today so I could see him in person. This is the first time I've met him in person too, so not box screen. So thank you, Matt, for taking the time today. This is Matt's first week. He started with the county on Monday. Matt, just to let you know, there's been several weeks that the board has thought you've already been with us. So I think it's really important he's here today so that we formally announce his start. Just as a point of background, Matt previously served in a variety of key positions across our region, including Assistant Regional Planner for Metro, Economic Development Manager for the City of Woodburn, and most recently as the Senior Project Manager of Eco Northwest. We are so looking forward to Matt assuming his role and working to create and implement economic development plans, programs, and services to promote economic prosperity. It is important to just focus just on this role, just for those community members who may be watching. While supporting a strong and equitable and inclusive economy countywide, Matt's focus will be on unincorporated Washington County as well as smaller cities, recognizing that our larger cities have their own economic development staff. He will work in partnership with those cities, such as we've seen success over this last year with our COVID work. So welcome, Matt, and I didn't know if you wanted to maybe say a couple things.
Sure. Thank you, Tanya. Good morning, Board Chair and Board Commissioners. Thank you, everyone, so much for the kind welcome to Washington County. And thanks for the invitation to join this morning. I am enthusiastic about taking on this role of Economic Development Manager for the county. And I'm looking forward to working with all of you to support Washington County businesses and communities. There's certainly a lot of work to do and get done, and some very immediate tasks like continuing the ongoing work to provide assistance to businesses across the county that have been adversely affected by the COVID economic downturn. One of the first things that I want to do, the first thing on my list here, is to get to know both internal and external stakeholders. You all, of course, very much included in that list. So please watch for a calendar invite soon. I'd like to sit down with each one of you individually to hear more about your goals, policy initiatives, and county-wide work. So thank you again. I'm looking forward to working with everyone here at Washington County and across the Washington County communities.
Thanks, Matt. So the weekly COVID workforce update, we do have one positive case, 3 employees who are currently quarantined due to close contact, and then 2 who are quarantined awaiting test results. Also, just wanted to let you know that on Thursday, I've been asked by Polco, which is a community engagement and survey company, to serve on a community engagement panel with other county administrators and city managers. So that is on Thursday this week, and that concludes my update.
Thank you, Ms. Angie. Alan, anything in the legal realm?
We have an executive session a little bit later today, and that's it. Nothing more.
Thank you. Ms. Taniguchi Dennis, Clean Water Services.
Thank you, Chair Harrington, and good morning, Board of Directors. I just have to report that this is our third week of no new COVID cases at Clean Water Services. The staff is doing really well and looking forward to this summer that's approaching us. So thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, we don't have a formal meeting today, so we don't need to go over the agenda items for that. We all should have received the forward rolling agenda as part of our information set from our roundtable last week. And unfortunately, like today, for our work sessions and meeting day, well, for our Tuesdays through the middle of April, we have very full agendas and very full days. I know I'm looking forward to a little bit of a flow differential after that. So fingers crossed as we then go forward into the budget season. So without further ado, we'll pick back up with agenda item 2 with Marnie Kyle for a potential ordinance 830 pertaining to exotic animals. Take it away, Marnie.
Good morning, Chair Harrington and Commissioners. It's nice to be here talking to you about something that isn't, I didn't know what was happening there, something that's not COVID. So it's kind of nice to be here on a new topic today. We know you have a packed agenda, so we'll try to be quick so that you have some time to discuss this potential ordinance. I just wanted to really quickly let you know that the reason we're bringing this forward is because a couple of months ago, there was testimony during the open comment time asking the board to consider some changes to our exotic animal update. And we also had several constituents who sent emails to various commissioners, including Commissioner Treese, who then convened a meeting with some of the constituents that were really specific about what they were looking for. And she included Randy Covey and Brad and I in that conversation, and then just asked us to bring this forward for the board to discuss. So that's kind of the why are we here today and why are we raising this issue again, because I'm not sure that all of you got constituent emails, but several of you did. So Brad is just going to walk us through a brief history of what our current ordinance looks like and what changes are being suggested. And then Randy has some recommendation from the standpoint of the staff that would be responsible for carrying out any changes to the ordinance. And we hope to leave you plenty of time to discuss whether you want to move forward with this or not. So with that, I will turn it over to Brad.
Good morning, Commissioners. Next slide, please. So this is, I'm going to provide you with a brief history of our current ordinance and how we got there. So in 2017, a number of constituents came to the Board of Commissioners to discuss concerns about a particular facility in general, but the overall issue of exotic animals in Washington County. So we started looking into what the Board of Commissioners could do to address exotic animals. And there is a state law that allows local government to ban exotic animals as defined in state law from their jurisdiction. In 2017, the board directed staff to prepare such an ordinance. There were many hearings that, and there was a lot of debate and strong positions on whether to enact an exotic animal code. Eventually, after some amendments, changes, exceptions, the board did pass an exotic animal code, and that went into effect in September of 2018. Next slide. So what does Ordinance 830 do? It bans the keeping of certain exotic animals in unincorporated Washington County. Those animals include most large cats, lions and tigers, primates, exotic dogs, bears, except for black bears, and crocodiles and members of that family. The ordinance also banned the direct contact between exotic animals and the public. There was a lot of testimony regarding that issue, and the idea that individuals should not be what happens in the industry is you can get your photo taken with an exotic animal, and the board did not want that to happen, and so ban direct contact with exotic animals as well. Like I said, the current code uses the definitions from state law. There was a number of exceptions that were built into the code. One that spent a considerable amount of time on was what I would consider legitimate zoos. And so we went with what's called the AZA standard and allowed for those types of facilities, even though we don't have any in Washington County. And we allowed for one traveling circus to come through. The ordinance also has an enforcement process that's based on complaints. So that's what our current ordinance says. Next slide. What our ordinance does not address is it does not ban elephants, even though clearly they're exotic to Oregon. Because we use the state definition, it did not include elephants. The code also does not ban black bears or cougars because they're indigenous to Oregon and are not exotic. Next slide. So the constituent request is to add elephants, black bears, and cougars to the list of animals that should be banned and remove the exception for temporary circuses that's in the current code. Next slide. Randy, I think you're going to take this on.
Yes, thank you, Brad. Good morning, Chair Harrington, members of the Board of Commissioners. Thank you for making time for us this morning. My name is Randy Covey, Manager of Animal Services. As Brad and Marnie both mentioned, this has been brought forward by constituents. I want to thank Commissioner Treese for responding to that and allowing us the opportunity to explore this and to make some recommendations related to those constituent requests. In research, when Commissioner Treese brought this to our attention, I contacted the Oregon Department of Agriculture and the Oregon Fish and Wildlife and determined that in fact elephants are not regulated by the state. However, cougars and black bears, because they are indigenous to the state of Oregon and therefore are not exotic, they are regulated by the state, and I was pleased to find out that they in fact are regulated in the same way that we have chosen to regulate exotic animals here in Washington County, and that people that hold black bears and cougars for the Department of Fish and Wildlife are required to meet the same AZA Association of Zoos and Aquarium standards that we establish as the gold standard here in Washington County. For that reason, we are not recommending that cougars and black bears be additionally regulated by Washington County. That would be redundant, and we're concerned that it would also remove the ability of Fish and Wildlife to have foster homes or other necessary care for animals, bear cubs, for example, that might be orphaned And it might remove a resource for them to have temporary holding for those animals while they pursue other placement. However, elephants are not regulated. We would support adding elephants to the definition of exotic animals banned in Washington County. Next slide, please, I believe. We would also support removing the exception that currently allows traveling circuses to come through Washington County for a limited duration once per year, as Brad pointed out. The result of taking action on these recommendations would be preventative in nature. It would prevent these things from happening. We're not aware of any current plans. We're not aware of any current elephants in Washington County or any plans to obtain them. There haven't been any traveling circuses for some time. However, that is a societal change that's been happening over the last decade. I would say that society in general is not supportive of traveling circuses. There are bans in our neighboring counties, and there is actually a state a bill at the state legislature that also addresses traveling circuses. So we would support that. Next slide, please. The question before your board today is twofold. First, would you like us to pursue initiating changes to the current exotic animal ordinance? In other words, I don't need to tell you, but the choice today is whether you would like us to pursue that, and if so, we'll draft the appropriate language, bring it back to you for public hearings, readings, and a vote on the actual language. And if you would like to pursue it, do you support the recommendations that we're making that would be to add elephants to the exotic animal ban in Washington County, not add black bears and cougars because they are already regulated by the state, and to remove the exception for traveling circuses. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions, but in respect for your time, I'll stop there.
Commissioners, what are your thoughts?
I'd like to, Chair, I'd like to jump in here for, first of all, I really want to thank Randy and Marnie and Brad for the work on this. The constituents did reach out to me on several occasions, and to give you some background, I sat through as commissioner-elect the meetings that were very contentious in 2018 regarding the initial ordinance that was passed. And it was my impression leaving those meetings that it was implied that this would be an evolving situation. So when the constituents reached out to me, I supported their interest in continuing to evolve the ordinance. When they asked for the black bears and the cougars to be added, I was not aware of the regulations that currently exist at the state level. So it's been a group effort to come up with an adjustment or an amendment to the ordinance that I believe is appropriate. So with that, I just leave it there for you to understand what my history has been with this.
Other commissioners?
I have a question, Randy. Pam, you did cite it very well. It was contentious and it was very difficult. And I guess I'm the only one remaining on that board, but we weren't really interested in keep visiting this. And so I don't know if I'd characterize it was evergreen and it was always going to be reviewed, but I don't have a big issue. I'm not certain what it means as various species that we have that are not indigenous, parakeets, parrots. I mean, it could be lots of things that would be out there. So I'm not certain how we would address those if somebody said, well, you have a bird show, and those birds are not indigenous to this area. So that's one question. Another question is there any, and this is a legal question for you, Brad, is there any restraint of trade under U.S. law, pardon me, my throat today, under U.S. laws regarding the ability of free enterprise folks to do whatever they choose to do, as long as it's not dangerous to the public? So I have a question there. I also have a question as to what period of time exotic or indigenous means, because we're certainly trying to bring back certain species that are no longer here in Oregon. And does that mean that if we bring mountain goats back, for instance, that were here but gone and for some period of time, are those not an issue as well? So as far as the ordinance and what Pam is bringing or suggesting in regard to elephants, I certainly don't have a dog in the fight, and I certainly can support what we're doing. I just want to make certain that we're on legal ground.
Chair Harrington, Commissioner Rogers, I believe I'll take a couple of those questions, and then of course Brad can chime in. I think the first question you asked, Commissioner Rogers, was regards to the currently banned exotic animals, and where does the banning stop? As I recall, the original conversation was focused primarily on the definition as outlined in the state law that bans the exotic animals that Brad listed, and those are partly because of public safety. Those are considered to be some of the more dangerous exotic animals that, if they were to escape or something, that they would cause the biggest risk to public safety. I think that is what drives the conversation around which ones to ban. As far as regulation of where does that stop? Well, that of course is anybody's guess. But having 30 years in the animal welfare field, I can tell you that in general, those of us that advocate for animal welfare try to be reasonable about what's allowed and what's not, and try to apply public safety and animal welfare in equal measures, and also consider the freedom of people to do things that enhance their life or also allow them to pursue their interests. In terms of regulation of exotic animals, they are very well regulated at the federal level. And the USDA has strict regulations about the keeping, inspections, and things of that nature. They don't generally restrict ownership. At the federal level, they generally are inclined to monitor or manage ownership by putting requirements on the keeping, certain caging requirements, and they do conduct inspections. And we do also have a good relationship with the Dr. Gwen Hallberg, who's the current USDA veterinarian responsible for this area. So we have good communication, and we're aware of things that come up. So hopefully that answers those questions for you.
So this is Brad.
Brad, before you start, Randy, it really didn't, but that's okay. And the reason it didn't, and again, I'm not picking on the ordinance. If we want to do it, that's not a problem. But I suspect you're talking about mammals and not birds. That we're not doing that. I suspect that you're not talking about any kind of aquarium operations, because fish are often kept, which are not indigenous to this area. Anybody who has guppies, angelfish, or a variety of saltwater animals are keeping them. So I assume that that's not the case. When Dick was on the board, he was pretty good about looking at that, that whole area. Where are we stepping so that we don't have some future board step into something that we created? So I assume that it's just mammals, not fish, not birds, not anything else. And I think you're nodding yes. And I assume it's only those who we can regulate if there was a reintroduction of species wolves, for instance, which happened, mountain goats, which were gone and were reintroduced in our southern part of our state. All of those, it wouldn't apply if somebody brought them into Washington County because they felt that that was appropriate. So if your answer is yes, then I'm not being a big deal about this. I just want to make certain that we're covered so that we don't have another meeting in another year and somebody said, well, why can't I do that, or why can't I ban that? So, and I'll stop asking.
Chair Harrington, Commissioner Rogers, thank you for the clarification. I wish I could answer that with some certainty. What I can tell you is that the requests that have been brought forward previously and today are very specific to the exotic animals that are currently banned. And in this case, just elephants are the only ones that we're recommending. If you choose to pursue adding them, we would suggest we add those. We would not recommend that we add cougars and black bears because they are indigenous to Oregon and already live here. We would have to consider future requests as they come in. I wish I could tell you that they won't, but they may.
Well, I just want to say that, you know, we can manage that a bit because we're really tied to the state definition of exotic animals. So people couldn't just come in and start adding animals without, you know, unless you wanted to really move quite a ways away from the state definition of exotic animals. We feel like elephants is just, you know, probably an oversight that it wasn't included, but we don't have any intention of supporting adding birds and, you know, lizards and fish. So we have no intention of supporting that. You know, constituents can ask for anything, I think is what Randy's trying to balance with his answer. And the board can ask for anything, but we really are going to try to stick with the state definition, and Brad can probably, if that's not clear enough, can answer more.
So this is Brad, and I would agree, and that's why Commissioner Rogers, you remember when we first enacted this, we stayed within the state definition. We are aware elephants aren't within the state definition, but we are aware of other counties that have banned elephants in Oregon. So we don't feel like we're getting too far astray with this request. If it was, as Marnie said, if we went beyond this, I think that you would hear a lot more reservation from staff on any such constituent request.
Commissioner Rogers, anything else?
I don't think so. Thank you both for your answers. And Brad, is there any prohibition against circuses? I mean, I haven't seen one in a bazillion years and don't know if they even exist anymore. But can we, under federal law, can we do, if somebody comes in and says, I meet all the standards and this is my business, can we ban that?
Well,
if we can, fine. I mean, I just don't know.
Well, Commissioner Rogers, as you may recall, we actually created an exception that we didn't have to for circuses. So we are allowed under state law to ban exotic animals from the county, and that could include circuses that are coming through. So there's no real concern there. We just created an exception. You know the reasons why it had to do with the fairgrounds and some past practices that we're not doing anymore.
Commissioner Fire, Commissioner Willie. Nothing from Commissioner Willie, nothing from Commissioner Fye. Commissioner Willie gave a thumbs up, so it looks like the answer to the questions from him is yes. Okay, Commissioner Fye?
I guess I was saying I don't have a comment, or I don't have questions, but I guess, as a public health person, I do believe in preventative measures, but I'm not sure if the constituents were requesting to add, we're not concerned about elephants. Should we do all this work when we actually have state laws that prevent circuits? And so I'm not sure, Marnie, if you're, or Randy, if you have the capacity right now to be able to do all this work, just to add the definition of elephants, or should we hold? But I just like Commissioner Rogers, I don't really have a dog in the fight. So I'm open to suggestions and whatever the rest of the commissioners want to do.
So Chair Harrington and Commissioner Fye, if I may just clarify, there's not a state law that bans elephants. There's a state law that allows counties to ban exotic animals. And so we have the ability to do that at the county level, but just to be clear that there is no state law that bans elephants.
Yes, I meant circuits.
Okay, and there also is no state law that bans circuses. It allows us to do that. The state law allows us to do that. So, it's really up to your board if you did want to move forward. We've made the recommendations about what we would suggest.
Yeah, I think, Mike, when I talk with you, Marnie, I'm going to leave it up to the board what they want to do and what everyone feels. But I'm not sure. I haven't seen any circuits on the way, as we talked about. But so I'm fine with either way. If we want to open up this ordinance to change and include elephants of the exotic animals that are banned, if that's what we want to do as a board, I'm fine with that.
Okay, so I'll round it out. So the questions are, do we want to initiate changes and appropriate, and put through, so do we want to do the work? And the work is really based on what do we want to try and achieve. So the recommendation is to add elephants to the definition of exotic animals for the purposes of Washington County Code. I don't see any reason at this point in time to not add that language. Certainly the Oregon Zoo is no longer investigating having an off-site facility to help further the protected species of Asian elephants. So no risk there. In fact, there's a lot of learnings based on that in terms of what would be the most appropriate geography there for that, and Washington County isn't it. Then on removing the exception for temporary circuses, I don't have any problem with that either. So those are my answers for the second question. With regard to the work, I haven't really heard what the extent of the work will be, both for staff to put together this language as well as for the process for the board. Certainly, I don't want us to take already tight meetings and extend them further. So I think that timing needs to be looked at. But I'm more than happy to see this through. The last thing I want to checkpoint this is that it's pretty clear that the management of the whole West Side Commons as a facility for visiting consumer shows, and so forth, other activities, needs to make sure that it adheres not only to our county code, but also to the state definition of exotic. And I've heard a reference to that intimated through this Q&A, but I didn't really see that as recognized as something as part of the presentation here. So could that please be summarized for me?
So Chair Harrington and commissioners, thanks for those comments. I'll let Brad answer the question about the Westside Commons, but I just wanted to address the workload question, and I appreciate that you're taking that into consideration. I think from the staff perspective, this is a relatively simple change to the ordinance. It would be pretty simple to add the language and schedule, meetings for the board. At a minimum, it would be a first reading and then the first public hearing. And at that point, the board potentially could vote. Because there isn't really any known opposition to adding this, we wouldn't anticipate a lot of public debate, and we don't anticipate that it's going to be like the last time. But you never know what the public is going to do. We think it would be relatively a simple process. So it's really a matter of whether the board would want to add those two board sessions to make this happen. And I'll let Brad answer the question about the Westside Commons. And my impression is they understand and are following the current code and state laws. But Brad can answer anything else.
Yes, Commissioner Harrington, thank you for that question. There's the background behind that comment was when this ordinance was being first developed in 2017, 2018, there was concern that at the Westside Commons in the past, there had been traveling circuses. And so we didn't want to look inconsistent with our past practice, recognizing that the facility is actually in the city of Hillsborough, so this ordinance doesn't technically apply to them, and it's whatever the city of Hillsborough regulates, which they don't, in fact, regulate this type of exotic animals to this degree. But since that ordinance passed, we wanted to make sure and worked with staff to make sure that they are no longer doing any activities that would be inconsistent with this ordinance. And so they have not had circuses. They have not had any animal that would be banned by this ordinance at the facility. There was a request very recently to put on an event that would have those, I think the crocodile nature. And our facility was clear to the promoter that no, that is not allowed. If the board is interested, we can make sure that it's in policy, but clearly the practice is that they're following this ordinance.
I'd just like to make one other quick comment, and that is that the ordinance still includes the accreditation piece from AZA in relationship to any businesses or activity that might be started, and the chair referenced a potential elephant preserve or something like that. And if it were AZA accredited, that this would not apply. I just want to point that out as well.
So you've got three of us who are perfectly willing to move ahead on this. I would just ask Ms. Angie that we'd be very sensitive to the fact that our agendas are pretty jam-packed between now and the middle of April, including the middle of April. So the other, sorry, I did have another question, and this goes to Alan Rapplier. Given how this ordinance had a lot of people testifying previously. We are in the midst of updating our rules and procedures to make it clear that anyone who comes to speak to us has 3 minutes and 2 minutes and so forth. Will we get that adopted before we have a public hearing on this proposed ordinance?
Madam Chair, that's kind of up to the timeframes of the board. We made that an action item, and they'll be working with staff to get it in front of the board as soon as possible. But again, as those rules state, you get to do whatever you want with those. If it's going to be a big crowd there, you can say we're not going to do with the board's consensus. We're not going to do group testimony. We're just going to limit. If it's a big crowd, we're going to limit it to 1 minute or 2 minutes. So you have ultimate flexibility on that.
Yep. Okay. Just making sure staff's thinking about timing. Thank you. Any last questions or comments from commissioners? All righty. Thank you very much. We'll move on then to the third topic, Oregon Toll Program update.
Oh. Is Amanda there? I can't.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I can see you. Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. Amanda Garcia Snell and I are here to give you a short update on the I-5 Oregon toll program. Next slide, please. So our purpose is really to review the toll program and schedule with you. Amanda's going to talk about the new equity framework from the committee that she's working on, which is one of the most significant steps that's been taken so far, and really just review where we are in the process and determine your interest for more information and highlight some future input opportunities. Next slide. So just a little bit of background I'm going to minimize so I can see the slide there. You'll remember that HB 2017 directed the Oregon Transportation Commission to develop a proposal for tolling on I-5 and 205 as part of that package. And the ODOT got busy. They formed a committee and completed a metro area value pricing study. And as a result of that, recommended segments on I-5 and I-205 where tolls could be applied, as well as consider in the long term, looking at the full I-5 and I-205 corridors. So ODOT submitted to Federal Highways, and in 2019, the Federal Highway Administration approved ODOT to continue to work on toll implementation process and set out guidelines. So then in 2020, the Oregon Department of Transportation began the process, and instead of creating a new committee for a policy advisory committee, they are turning to the Region 1 Act for policy input. That is, and for policy input primarily on, as they start the environmental analysis for the toll program, focusing on the I-205 portion, which includes the Abernathy Bridge and the adjacent lanes. Next slide. So just to remember, as this was defined in HB 2017, the toll program has a dual purpose of both to generate revenue and to manage demand. Next slide. So in the initial steps of what ODOT has done so far, they've initiated that scoping for the environmental analysis for a toll program, not the construction of the bridge itself, but for the toll program for I-205 on the Abernathy Bridge in the adjacent area. Your board had a presentation from ODOT in August of 2020 and submitted comments in 2020. And some of the points in your key points from the letter that you submitted back then was support for the dual purpose of managing congestion and revenue from the toll program, the need to understand diversion impacts, request to consider the whole system together, I-5 and 205, and not just think of this as one segment, and importantly, to keep equity in the forefront. Your board also requested a role to participate be a participating agency in the environmental process. And as a result, some of you may have received an email last week with a slew of methodology reports and a coordination plan. That is the beginning of the environmental process, and staff will be looking through the methodology reports, particularly on the traffic, which is going to be most controversial in this work. And the August, when you had a presentation on from ODOT last year, ODOT has now compiled all of the comments that they received, which were a lot, and we'll be releasing those comments on the scoping phase soon as they move forward. I think I'm going to turn this to Amanda, because what the other work that ODOT has done is establish an equity and mobility advisory committee to develop an equity framework for the toll program, not just for the I-205 segment, but for the full I-205 program, the full length of I-5 and I-205. So Amanda, do you want to step in?
Sure. Hi, Chair and Board. Amanda Garcia Snell, Community Engagement Manager in the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement. So as Chris mentioned, ODOT established the Equity and Mobility and Advisory Committee to develop not only the equity framework, but to really look at process equity and to look at equity outcome measures and performance metrics. Next slide, please. So as you know, supporting equity, increasing diversity, ensuring inclusion takes a lot of time and a lot of investment and resources, and really a lot of commitment in order to hear from voices that have been historically excluded or underrepresented in processes in transportation projects. It's no different than what we see in a lot of other areas in our history. So equity definition for transportation projects is here at the top of the slide. It's the just allocation of burdens and benefits within a transportation system. And so although that's a few words, it takes a lot to really think through that and how do we really do that. So the Equity Mobility Advisory Council is really focused on bringing voices and perspectives not traditionally or currently included into the planning process. So it's a 2-year process, 15 members who include representation from all over the Portland metro area and Southwest Washington. And there are there's a county representative from each of those four counties, Washington County, Clackamas, Multnomah, and Clark. So, and then there are also community organization representatives as well, and some other agency representatives on that committee. And thank you for putting my name forward to be on this committee, because it's really such important work and a great experience, and I'm really appreciative to have that opportunity. So the Equity Mobility Advisory Committee started meeting in 2020, and we have been doing virtual meetings, which has been a great learning for me to be on that side of the virtual meeting space. And so the equity framework was developed. It took a few months for us to work through that, about I want to say 5 months of conversation and process in that, and was finalized in December. And now we are using that framework and looking to that to further the process equity journey. Next slide, please. So ODOT's equity for ODOT's toll projects are described in these two ways: process equity and then outcome equity. And process equity is really from beginning to end. How are we thinking about meaningful participation? And then outcome equity, really those performance measures and what do we have at the end to really address inequities and reduce burden and especially with disparate communities. So the focus is for the equity framework, and I think you have a link to that in the agenda item. So we didn't attach it, but if you're curious, you can look at it. It's 5 pages, something like that. But essentially, it's focused on these 4 bullets on the bottom: full participation, affordability, access to opportunity, and community health. And so by full participation, that means impacted populations and communities will play a major role throughout the project. Agency accountability and transparency will be a key component of the TOL project's activities. And then affordability, the projects will explore how to improve the affordability of the transportation system to affected populations and communities. Access to opportunity, the TOL projects will focus on improving multimodal access to the region's opportunities for historically excluded and underserved communities. And then community health. So the TOL project will address air quality, noise, traffic safety, economic impacts, and other potential effects of historically excluded underserved communities. And as you know, community health is broad, and so that also includes the impacts of rerouted traffic and things like that people might do to avoid the tolls. And that is all I have for this phase. The next step is focusing on those outcome measures, and that'll be touched on the last one. Any questions about the EMAC at this stage?
Miranda, I'm thinking somebody else's name. I'm sorry. I have one, and I'm pleased you're involved. I had mentioned your name as well as James Paulson to the committee, and I'm glad you're both on there to vote on. There's an issue in the equity area that I've asked on several occasions, and I'm yet to get an answer, and I understand why it's complex, but I'll just throw it out, and then you can do it. Probably not now, you can offline with me, but the tolling is not real popular because I asked him directly with Peter DeFazio. He doesn't like it. And he's in a very powerful position, as we all know. I also heard Earl talking about it, and he's saying, nice to explore, but has some challenges. And Jamie Herrera Butler, I think her name is, I don't know her, but up in Washington has also expressed big concern. So the federal delegation is not exactly excited. And I understand, but we need to explore options as part of a role. The issue comes in the equity area that we're talking about not a Oregon project even. These are federal highways. And we have people who drive these highways from Medford and from Eugene, where Peter's from, and all south, east, not too much west, but east and south. And they have folks who would have some difficulty in paying tolls, and they have the equity issue just the same. And my question then is that I've asked over and over, how do we include those voices? And the answer is, well, it's too big an area and we can't. We just do from the local area, but understanding that as much as we might want something or talk about something or explore something, you got a lot different players who are actually voting on if this goes forward. So is there any discussion, and again, it's a long question and probably a long answer back, that you might provide me either short right now or maybe offline so that I understand what's going on in that?
Sure. I guess the short answer that I would say is that the focus of the EMAC is around, or at least my interest is around the Washington County impacted, communities that are impacted in Washington County. That doesn't mean to say that other voices aren't important and that other people won't experience disparities related to cost, but there are also, which is part of the conversation, it's a big part of the conversation, the cost of this and what that might mean to people. There are a lot of other pieces to equity beyond the affordability, right? The surrounding communities will be impacted in some way. And so it's critically important, I think, to have voices especially that we haven't typically heard from, to be included in that conversation. And so that's really my focus. I think that the health of the surrounding communities is important, especially, what we know historically about parts of the interstate system is that there were big environmental justice concerns, and those projects were cited in places where if people had a voice, the voice wasn't heard, and in many instances they didn't have a voice. And so this is an opportunity to make sure that we don't further create further disparity, that we don't further the burden, and that we do everything we can to hear from folks that are impacted. And while yes, I would love for my work to span across the country, I think this is such a big issue that that Washington County is that's my heart, and that's where I focus on the impacted communities in the county. And having this regional effort certainly allows us to share conversations across the region and into Southwest Washington. And I think that those of us on the committee while we all have specific areas that we are maybe more concerned about than others, we all share the same vision of hearing from people who don't have an opportunity, who haven't in the past have an opportunity to participate. That's a long, short answer.
Commissioner Rogers, do you have any other comments or questions based upon the feedback to your question?
No, it's a good answer. It's a short answer, I understand, and I appreciate your work. It's important work. It's just that, unfortunately, and I understand the impact of the areas. That has a huge issue on Washington County in terms of the diversion of toll dollars to local communities. That Washington County residents are going to pay for a supposed maybe not even an expansion that isn't established, but a lot of tolls, and it'll go to other areas outside of Washington County. And so they need to go into eyes wide open that there's some real issues in the tolling. And as far as the equity issue, I just, it's hard when you work, for instance, on a Region 1 where you're also including Hood River County, and they're saying, well, we have equity issues too, and do we have to pay tolls coming through your area? And so then you get the dispersion. People are starting to look and say, let's not use the Port of Portland facilities, let's go to Tacoma, and that's what's happening. Or let's look and see how we divert all commerce out of certain corridors, and that's not good for our economy. So this is a very difficult, and I know you know it, it's very difficult. Whole bunch of issues to deal with. I'm just proud of you for jumping in and being willing to serve. I think it's great.
Thanks.
So commissioners, Amanda was checkpointing to see if you had any questions or comments at this point. Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
Okay.
Commissioner Treese?
Excuse me. I just want to make sure that I'm staying in the loop as to what the discussions are. And Amanda, thank you for your work on this. You're the right person to be there. And I'm just stating that I'd like to make sure I'm in the loop on the discussions. So I'm saying this as much for Megan, who I'm sure is listening. So thank you.
Yeah, and that'll be, Chris is going to finish the presentation, and how you all want to continue to be engaged will be part of that.
Commissioner Fry? No, nothing? Okay, so I'll round it out. For the equity framework, well, first off, for tolling, we know over these past, the 5 years since HB 2017 was developed and all of the work leading up to this, the Federal Highway Administration is really looking to states and regions to do tolling examination before they will support additional major funding for highway expansion or construction. So this is an area that is difficult for Oregon because we don't have any tolling at all. So the state and the greater region are being very thoughtful in going about this. Despite political sentiment one way or the other. The administration is asking us to do this work, and so it's taken state legislative action to provide the political cover in order to go through this planning effort. And who knows where it will end up. But I'm glad it's being done thoughtfully. With regard to, Amanda, the equity framework, I think this is well thought out. I appreciate the category focus areas as you highlighted and listed in the equity framework. And I believe that we need to put all of our weight behind this effort and support it fully. It's being done well, as highlighted and summarized here, on both the process equity and the outcome equity. And we need to continue to support it and see it through and go from there. So those are my recommendations and thoughts on the equity framework. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will kick it back to Chris.
Okay, thanks. We just have a couple more wrap-up slides. Yes, so you will soon see the results of the public comments and responses. And one of the things that ODOT is now doing is moving forward in response to your comments and comments from others, that it's hard to think of a toll program as being in one segment. They're moving forward to analyze the tolling on the I-5 and I-205 overall. The environmental process will focus on the I-205 project, but the recommendations will be, I think, scaled up, I think is the way to be considered for its suitability to expand across the I-5 and I-205 corridors. So it makes engagement in the I-205 project much bigger than just the project itself, because of its implications corridor-wide. And you'll see this, the Oregon Transportation Commission has already identified policies to allocate revenue collected to be spent in the corridors. There's state legislation now that our government relations folks are tracking to support the toll program overall. So it's really moving forward. The environmental analysis is moving forward on the I-205 project, but the planning is going on concurrently with thinking about how this will play out across the corridor. And this is true, as Amanda pointed out, for the equity framework. It's not just for the environmental analysis part, but for the corridors as a whole. I think one last slide, next slide, I think is our last. So this is what comes next. And this gets to it's been a long time since we've talked about this. We want you to know what's coming up so we can make sure that you're engaged when you need to be. Right now, on the project side, the technical analysis is beginning. As I said, the methodologies for how they're going to analyze traffic and pricing and all of that is now beginning. By the end of 2021, ODOT expects to have a draft preferred alternative. And so somewhere in third quarter of this calendar year, we expect there to be more for input on the I-205 project. And then, Amanda, you want to highlight the upcoming milestones for the equity work?
Sure. So in the next few meetings, we'll be refining some of the process equity measures and then also looking to the outcome equity metrics. And so those will be coming, and I'm happy to bring those back to you if you would like to provide feedback or share them with you, or whatever way that you all would like to be engaged with that.
I think we have one more slide. Yes, so that's just how would you best like to get information. Certainly Amanda has a lot to share on the equity side. Would you like a briefing either individually or to the board from the ODOT toll program staff? I know I have reached out to toll program director Lucinda Broussard to ask questions. She's extremely knowledgeable and helpful in answering questions about this program. And then I don't have a schedule now for what's coming forward at the Region 1 Act, but that will also be an opportunity to share comments to put forward to the Region 1 Act. So comments on how you'd like to continue to be involved?
Okay, commissioners, who would like to go first in answering these questions?
Chair, I have a question for you, Christina. Going back to the previous slide on the map slide, that one. I'm just trying to understand what this map means. Is this where I see a lot of the improvements or projects that are highlighted, but I'm wondering is like the seismic study, the bottleneck, is that where the pole is going to be, the tolling pole? Or is this, so what is this map basically? I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, that's a great question. This map was put together by the new Urban Mobility Office, which has taken the lead for all of the significant system-wide major projects in the region. And they have developed this map to basically to illustrate all the activities that are going on the main freeway system in the region. So the NEPA, the environmental analysis, is really focused on the I-205 improvements and seismic upgrades. That's the focus of the environmental analysis. And then you'll also recognize, for example, a separate project that ODOT is moving forward on the I-5 Rose Corridor. So they have pulled together a map of all of the various activities that are going on right now on this system. The I-5 Boone Bridge is a study they would like to do. I don't believe they have started yet. And this is an example that we can have someone come back from ODOT and talk about the range of projects, but these are all projects that are in the works or planned on the major system. And it's been developed, as I understand, as really a communication tool to show that it's not just, to look at the system as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christine. I guess my question is for Amanda. The Equity and Mobility Advisory Committee, how much influence does that have for the whole project? Because I think, in order to address fairness and equity in transportation, or really addressing congestion, it would take a lot of, doing things differently and reforming our policies and practices. So what is the influence level of the equity, this committee, to dictate the direction of the whole project?
So as I understand it, the framework that the committee developed and the performance measures for the process equity, as well as the outcome measures, are all things that are being used in the larger community engagement process that is happening. So ODOT has a massive community engagement effort with community liaisons and community-based organizations in all of the regions, and so, throughout that region. And so all of these documents are guiding documents for that work. In terms of the influence of that, that's probably an ODOT question. I'm not sure how to answer that question. I assume that this will influence the work. That's what my understanding is. That we're not just going to report some documents that'll sit on the shelf, but.
Okay, that's good answer, Amanda. I'm fine with that. And, I guess my comment to your question will be then, I like to be involved, and whatever I can help as a commissioner to push ODOT to make sure the equity framework is meaningfully utilized, because well thought out, people committed and put their time and effort and really poured their heart out. So I really want to support. So whatever we can do, please push us and reach out. And if we need to invite ODOT to do a presentation for us to have those conversations about meaningfully including the equity framework suggestions into, I'm happy to do that. And I think the board will support that as well. In terms of briefings, I think I want to say yes, but I'm also concerned about my capacity and limitations. But I think I would like to stay engaged through online or whatever email updates that you send out, or there is some briefings that come out online. If you could include me in whatever email that goes out, I would really appreciate it. And however I can stay engaged in the project, I would gladly, I would welcome any suggestions.
Okay.
And so that's what I would say.
Thank you.
I want to say yes. I would like to have a once a month briefing, but also cognizant about capacity for you and for me and for everyone involved. But I do have a stake in this transportation, and I really want to see a progress for not only our region, but for our state.
Okay, thank you.
And I turn it back to you.
Mouse click didn't take. Other commissioners?
Well, thank you, Chair. From my standpoint, I would like to be periodically briefed on this. This is an amazingly long process. And I realize this is the first tolling project in Oregon, and this is all new stuff, primarily even certainly in the Northwest and up and down the West Coast. I mean, there's just not many tolls that we go through. But to me, it's kind of agonizing. I think, Chris, I hadn't heard, we get through this whole process. We published the toll project decision in January of 23, so nearly 2 more years for that. When would we feasibly think there'd be implementation of tolling?
Yeah, that's the question that I would defer to an ODOT person, their ODOT staff lead. I think it can happen pretty quickly after that. I know that the legislation ODOT is bringing forward is to seek the authority to bond against tolling revenue so they can use the funds more upfront. So I think it's pretty quickly after that, as I remember their data, but I would defer to some experts. I can get back to you on that. That's a good thing to know.
Well, again, yeah, it's, I don't even remember when this process started, but I think we'll be multiple years into this before we ever, as they say, the rubber hits the road. And I think that's probably a little frustrating to me, considering that our transportation funding sources are significantly limited, where we have a legislature that's extremely resistant to increasing the gas tax. We have a federal government that's even more resistant to the gas tax increases. And the only way we can pay for keeping our transportation main roads up to speed is very limited. So I'd sure like to see this process move ahead a little faster. I don't want to take any shortcuts, but I'd like to think we could do this in a little bit more efficient way. But that's not one of my questions. So yeah, I'll just say yes if you just keep me up to speed whenever it's convenient, and certainly not too burdensome for you. I would like to be made aware of any comments that we're going to forward to R1 Act, though. So that's critical to me to know what's the messaging we're sending.
Okay. Thank you.
To Jerry's point, Chris, could you re-emphasize, because most tolling projects in the country that we're familiar with, you toll and you add capacity. That's not a foregone conclusion in this one. We may pay, and there may not be any capacity increase, because it's, as you pointed out at the beginning, it's to limit the usage of the road. That's one of them. The other one is capacity, and that's one of the big arguments, and one of the ones that our business community should be fully aware of and engaged in, that if tolls are paid and they simply are diverted without any capacity increase, and that's why representatives from the state of Washington that I've talked to are not happy. They want to make a complete assurance that they're going to get some capacity increases. So Jerry, to your point, it's a good one, and it's exasperatingly slow. The equity is an important piece of it. That's a statewide issue with the representatives from downstate. And then you have this whole issue of what am I getting for this toll? And if it's all diverted to surrounding communities, we all pay more to drive on a freeway that's still the same. And so I'm not saying it's going to be that, but that's been really one of the basic issues from Hood River and from other areas. What are we getting, and what assurances, because they're not players in this conversation. So anyway, I'll just stop, but you may want to reemphasize if I'm wrong, Chris, on any of that.
No, yeah, I think you're right that will be, it's kind of like, counting the eggs before they're hatched. People are spending a lot of time thinking about where should the revenue go as part of this. So that again has not been defined. The OTC has given direction that it should be spent in the corridors where it's generated. But in terms of how does that mean? What does that mean? Is it capacity? That has not been defined. So yep, that is a key point that will be up for discussion. Other commissioners, any thoughts on the questions?
My request stands, just continued information, please.
Yeah.
And good work.
Can we put the slides back up, please? The question slides? Okay, so I'll round out the set of 5. So what, if you could go back one more slide to the one with the arrow timeline. So with regard to being involved, so there are multiple touch points that I think are critical. Having you, Amanda, participate on the Equity and Mobility Advisory Committee is very meaningful to us, as you're intimately aware of our commitment to Washington County's equity equity resolution. And also the framework really recognizes the historically underserved and marginalized community members. So I'll summarize it as racial equity, and that's really vital. As I've mentioned previously, I think we as Washington County need to put our full weight behind the equity framework. So I think I'd like to call the question with my colleagues, is that feedback that we want to ensure we provide a comment letter on for delivery through the Region 1 Act. Thoughts? Guess I'm the only one.
Are you saying we draft a letter to send it to regional? Yeah, I support that.
I guess I'd want to see what the letter said, but I don't have a problem with the concept of sending certainly comments to them. Is this, and let me make sure I understood your ask, is in support of the equity
framework,
framework and information that's
part of our packet today. Yep.
Yeah, and it's currently being discussed and evaluated, and Amanda certainly keeps us up with that. Is that you're just saying a letter of support with that?
So they have the framework defined, and now they're going to do the work exemplified by that framework. And I think it's important for us to use our voice to say we are in support of that framework.
I'm comfortable with that, especially in reference to our proclamation. And so I appreciate that.
We can
I'm
certainly
okay with the concept
have,
of it, certainly.
Okay. And we could certainly, I think your point is very well taken, that we should have the letter drafted up and make sure you're comfortable with what it says. But I first have to get your willingness to have such a letter drafted. So, so that's why I was calling that question. So thank you. I'll ask Elizabeth to work with Chris and Amanda to bring such a letter forward to us. One of your questions, don't worry, you don't have to go back to that slide. I printed it for myself. So I think there are major irrespective, well, let me back up. There is the schedule that the Region 1 Act meets on, and there are times when they're just given updates on the project, and also times where they're being asked for direction and input. And it's for those policy touch points that our board representative to the Region 1 Act needs to make sure to touch back with the commission.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a process for that through our board communication and with the staff support on that. And staff also does a really good job in the LUT happenings for the week in highlighting those things as well. Mm-hmm. So as one member of 5, I'm going to continue to rely upon that summary through that LUT weekly email, and for our Region 1 Act representative to come into our board work sessions and make sure to solicit our input in advance of those touch points. I think that's job 1 for the liaison. Then looking at this, I think it's important that from staff that we make sure to check in with regard to the draft. I realize you can't see me pointing at my screen. The draft preferred alternative, that's an important touch point. On the draft environmental assessment, really that's another important touch point with regard to if there are some policy considerations there. And then to make sure that we have a common opportunity for the finalization of the project decision. Outside of that, you've heard various commissioners wanting to be, receive more frequent emails, and, they can certainly, we each have the opportunity to subscribe to the project updates and all of that. But both for my individual needs as well as for what I see for the board as a work group, I would build touch points around that draft preferred alternative, the draft environmental assessment, and the toll decision. Mm-hmm. And then I trust your judgment to come back to us on exercising our policy voice with the various milestones from the Equity and Mobility Advisory Committee. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense to me. And I just want to jump in to say how This is a really big deal, this toll program, and I am pleased to hear the interest because it is 205 may seem like a long ways from Washington County, but it really has significance region-wide, and a lot of our goods and people, and we're all tied together in this region. So it is important for the Washington County to have a voice. And I know that Amanda and I stay in touch on this. And again, the ODOT staff is very helpful in explaining all this. We're all learning about tolling. It's all new. So it makes perfect sense to me, and we'll see what I can do. Amanda, you want to chime in?
That makes perfect sense to me. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I've certainly, through my 12 years being on the Metro Council, have been through copious presentations to the council from various experts around the world around cordon pricing, tolling programs, whether we're talking about London or in Sweden and Germany and here in various parts of the US. So it's like, okay, how are we going to look at this for use here in our state? I want to turn my checkpoint question back to the board. Do you think that my proposal for the board check-ins will serve you sufficiently well? It's not restricting you have that. Okay, great. Terrific. Anything else from anyone? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Chris and Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. We're a little bit after 10. Sorry, we've gone over a little bit. So now's a point where we'll take a 15-minute break. So see you back here at 10:21.
Chair, just to remind you, I will be off for about 30 minutes now. So just as a reminder, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. We'll see you when you return. Okay, see you back here in 15. Thank you.
Commissioners and staff, are you back with us? Welcome back, Commissioner Fye, Commissioner Treese, Chair Harrington. There's Alan, Commissioner Rogers.
Welcome back, everyone. Commissioner Willie had to step away for a little bit. So we'll pick back up on agenda item number 4, land use and transportation financial update. Take it away, Mr. Roberts.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. Appreciate some time on a busy agenda today just to let you know what's going on in LUT. And this is really a follow-up to a briefing that we gave back in October, and just wanted to sort of keep you up to date as to where things stand in the department right now. And then specifically, we have some information that we've shared with you individually, but want to talk with you as a group about, specific to current planning and building services, but also cover a few other areas in the department as well. I want to point out I have both Andy Back, our Planning and Development Services Division Manager, and Sheila Giambrone, who's our Senior Administrative Services Manager, so really our business manager for the department, are here as well. So I'll primarily work through the presentation, but Andy or Sheila may have a few points to offer up here as well along the way. And then we're all available to help answer some questions for you. Next slide, please. So we wanted to just start with a little bit of a snapshot of the department, so you get a picture of us, and then we'll focus in on the current planning and building services, some challenges we're experiencing there, some strategies we've developed to try to help address our upcoming fiscal year budget funding gaps that we anticipate. We'd like to share with you some parameters and solicit feedback that you might have on a sustainability assessment that we're planning to launch for those two business areas. Then we'll give you a quick update on long-range planning, which includes our community planning and transportation planning functions, the road fund, and the Major Streets Transportation Improvement Program, or MISTIP, and Urban Road Maintenance District. Next slide, please. So just very quickly at a high level, the department, we have 5 divisions, and those are sort of indicated by the gray boxes, and the leadership team managers are listed in the boxes there. So all in all, we have about 50 different budget programs in 17 different budget funds across the department. We're budgeted this year for 344 full-time equivalent employees. We have about 300 actual right now. So we're on average down about 13% across the department. And that factors into part of how we've been sort of mitigating through some of the challenges that we've been experiencing financially this year. Next slide. So zooming in on current planning and building services. So those are 2 separate budget funds, and they're 2 separate sections within the Planning and Development Services Division. So that's Andy's work group. So I know you may not be able to read it very well, but the current planning functions include what we call programs include what we call development assistance. So that's helping both residents and customers with minor development proposals. We have a development review group that handles land use reviews. If somebody wants to come in and build a subdivision or build a new office building, they go through the development review process to ensure community development code compliance. And then current planning also handles our land use code compliance or code enforcement. And then sort of in between those steps, let's say in our larger process, we have building services. So obviously they permit buildings and do inspections on building construction. Next slide, please. So for current planning, the focus of that group really is the urban unincorporated and the rural areas. And so, as I mentioned earlier, they inform property owners and developers about our land use regulations. They review about 400 or more development proposals each year, and again, looking at compliance with our comprehensive plan elements. And that work is fee supported. We process on average or receive about 160 land use code compliance complaints every year. And that work is funded with a general fund subsidy, $325,000. And that's been a fixed amount now for almost 20 years. But that is a subsidy that we do receive to help fund that work. We also do a variety of things, floodplain management, and there are other sort of what we would think of as kind of community-facing services where we don't really have a dedicated revenue source identified for those. And so in the past, historically, those have sort of been subsidized by development application fees. We touch about 50,000 customer or field about 50,000 customer and constituent inquiries in current planning every year. And that number has actually been trending up. It's an interesting dynamic. Sometimes when development activity slows, inquiries go up. We get more people that have a variety of questions and just interest in potential developments that may or may not move forward. And then we have our FTE budgeted at 18 and a half roughly, and our current FTE in that group is 13. So we're about 30% below budgeted, so significantly higher percentage than across the department as a whole. Next slide, please. So in building services, again, the focus of this work group is also urban unincorporated and rural areas. However, building services also provides contract services to Banks, Gaston, and North Plains for their building inspection and permitting functions, and also provides some contract support to a couple of cities for electrical plan review, permitting, and inspection. So again, their emphasis is on building construction on private properties, essentially. They issue about 12,000 permits a year, perform about 60 to 70,000 inspections every year. And again, the budgeted FTE there is just about 60. We're currently staffed just under 49, so about 20% below budget staffing right now. Next slide. So the challenges that we're facing are really that both of these funds and work groups are operating at a significant loss, and so fee revenue from development and building activity, just fluctuates quite a lot, right? Costs are increasing for these work groups and really all work groups across the county, and the fee revenue just goes up and down. So right now, it's been generally trending downward. We're seeing a slowdown in overall development activity. And then we're seeing a trend toward more smaller developments, which actually tend to have lower development fees. In the past, we would see much more large greenfield subdivision development and maybe larger commercial type projects, and those would help sort of subsidize some of our other operations. So we were starting to see these trends before COVID hit, so this isn't new. We have been sort of planning a slow kind of attrition, if you will, to sort of, match up staffing and expenditures with activities and revenues. Obviously, COVID has accelerated some of those trends that we've seen, and we have a couple of numbers there. Just looking at our year-over-year revenues starting in April of 2020, and then looking back to the prior year, we're down about $132,000 in current planning, $640,000 in building services. And we just got our numbers for last month, and I have not updated these yet, but I suspect there will be some slight changes in those numbers there. So we have a need, obviously, to bridge some identified gaps between our expected revenues and expenditures. And when I say that, that's sort of if we were to carry forward our assumptions about the current budget year into next budget year, we identified some gaps that we would expect between the revenues and the expenditures. And this is a recurring issue in these work groups. And so, we really do need to invest some time and energy in exploring a more sustainable funding model, and then thinking about the services that we provide and how we fund those services. Next slide, please. So a unique challenge in current planning is, as I mentioned earlier, we provide a lot of developer services, and we recoup costs or attempt to recoup costs for those through the fees that we charge for those services. And then, as I mentioned, we have those sort of community type services, and we'll talk just a little more about that. Our current planning fees are already among the highest in the region, and obviously we have concerns from what we call our mom and pop type developers. That may be a family that owns a piece of land, and they may come and visit us once to do a single project where they may want to add something or redevelop that property, but they're not professional developers. And so obviously the fees in some of those instances can be much more impactful on the resident or the constituent there. And as I mentioned, we're already operating at a pretty minimal staffing level, and so we are experiencing some service level impacts. The staff are struggling a little bit to keep up with workload, and so we are trying to be very mindful of the need to sustain services, even though we may be looking at some staffing reductions. Next slide, please. So just a quick slide on the idea of sort of the developer versus community services. We won't go through these, but I think a couple of them that we talked about are sort of the floodplain management, code compliance, which we do receive a subsidy that helps to reimburse some of those costs. And then there's just kind of a general role we play in supporting some economic growth that happens in the county, providing a lot of responses to inquiries from both constituents and, again, maybe potential developers that may or may not ever actually come in and see us with an actual fee generating application. Next slide, please. So this is a carryover from our October presentation. When we think about how to address some of the gaps that we've identified, we're talking about revenues and expenditures. So when we think about revenues, the two primary things that we are looking at potentially are fees and then potential for other funding sources. And then the dial that we control at the department level is sort of the staffing and service levels. So we can move on to the next slide. So as we've identified these gaps, like I said, this isn't new to COVID. So we had started taking some measures and we had a preliminary discussion about some of these issues with you last year, as I mentioned. So last year, the board did approved a fee increase for both building and current planning current planning at least in last fiscal year. And that was a phased increase. So half of the increase took effect in June, or rather July, it should be July 2020, and the other half in January 2020. That's been helpful this year, certainly. We initiated a voluntary separation program, and the reason there's a red box around some of these is that sort of corresponds with the ability that the things that are within the department's control. Those are we've been pretty proactive at trying to help address these with the tools that we have internally. So we did offer a voluntary separation program. We had 3 employees opt into that in building services, and so that's helpful. We are continuing, obviously, to hold vacant positions, and the staff are doing their best to try to figure out how to, sort of keep up services with reduced staffing. We've done some other things. These are relatively minor, but we've sort of turned over many rocks here, and we have revised some of our internal costing allocations. We've reduced our travel and training and materials and supplies budgets. And as we have reduced staffing, we have reduced some of our fleet expenses as well, corresponding to that. Next slide. Next. Oh, there we go. Thanks. So again, I don't want to beat this too much, but I think we are very mindful, and our staff certainly are mindful. They want to provide good customer service. A lot of our folks get into this line of work because they really want to do public service and help improve the communities that we live and work in. So these staffing reductions are triggering some delays in our permit review times, longer callback times, and one of the things that I sort of alluded to earlier is that we do get folks oftentimes that have a need to go through one of our permitting processes and may not really have the financial wherewithal to go out and retain professional consultants to try to help navigate what can be a relatively complicated process. The Oregon land use system by nature is fairly complex. And so, we do quite a bit of work with those customers and really try to help them navigate through the process as much as we can. And so as we have to focus, I think, more and more on sort of just meeting our timelines for the applicants that are, in the queue, that may curtail our ability to provide some of that additional support and service. And I just can't stress enough, I think, the sort of uncertainty, the insecurities, the reduced staffing, it is affecting the individuals in the work groups, and I certainly feel their their stress as well. And Andy, I don't know if you had anything that you'd want to add at this point.
Well, I do want to just make it clear that it's really the development assistance function that is being impacted the most, because we're having to make the hard decision between paying customers and non-paying customers. And so it's the folks who have phone calls who, expect a call back soon and we don't get to it soon, or the emails that we send back aren't in the detail that we want to provide, and we're just doing it, to get back to them and provide some information. But it's really the folks who aren't used to using our system who are getting impacted by the current situation more than those who have historically hired development consultants or lawyers and kind of know how to navigate our process.
Thanks. Next slide, please. So we have two very similar looking slides here. One's focused on current planning. We'll talk about that one first, and then we have a similar one for building services. So as we looked ahead at the upcoming fiscal year, and again, there are some assumptions here that I should mention briefly, that we've carried forward assumed expenditures from the current budget year into next budget year. We've carried forward assumed revenues from this year into next year, and just sort of identified if we continue to have those same sort of activity levels and costs, we anticipate that there's a gap of about just under $700,000 in the current planning fund. And I need to be really clear too, all of these numbers are just estimates, and they're all obviously subject to change. These are just our educated guesses as with the information that we have available. So as we think about how to tackle that gap, we've really tried to take a pretty balanced approach here. So we anticipate that we will likely need to reduce expenditures, again, comparing last year or the current budget year to the next budget year. And so we've targeted about $175,000 there. And we're not considering layoffs at this point. We're really working diligently to avoid that. That would always, of course, be our last resort. So we're really looking at opportunities for potential internal employee transfers or reassignments. There may be a need for some mandatory furlough days or potentially looking at FTE reductions. So perhaps reducing our 1.0 FTE employees down to something less than a 1.0. Obviously continuing to hold vacancies and again, just being mindful of how we try to balance the staffing with the service level needs. So the second element that we're looking at is we know that we'll need to probably continue spending down our fund balance, but what we're proposing for next year is a significantly slower rate of spending down that fund balance. And our target really is to try to keep our ending fund balance above $1 million. And that's a target that we've set as a place where we would need to look at further staffing reductions to really start to slow down the rate at which we might be spending through that fund balance. And we will be proposing some fee increases, and they're really targeted at just trying to help us improve cost recovery in some areas. And as I mentioned earlier, our fees are relatively higher than most other organizations, but we're trying to sort of keep in mind what I call our comparator jurisdictions. And in current planning, that tends to be Gresham and Portland. They're the two other agencies that really make a good faith effort at cost recovery for these types of functions. And then the last line here is in current planning, we are and have submitted to the County Administrative Office a request for some additional external funding support in current planning at a $360,000 amount. And so when we look at the dollar amounts, the external funding subsidy is roughly half of the gap amount that we've identified, and the other three measures are about half as well, as we're trying to get to that goal. And we've been proactive, as I mentioned earlier. So we've already actually done one employee transfer. So we've actually already made a dent in our expenditure reduction target number recently. So we're continuing to make some headway again with the tools that we have available to us. So next slide. So now looking at building services, so the trend again is very similar. The numbers are higher, but you'll see a very similar trend and pattern here. So again, we anticipate needing to figure out ways to reduce our spending, and so we again have, as we implemented the voluntary separation program, the 3 employees there, that will make a significant dent in that expenditure reduction target. So we've already made good progress there. Again, we'll need to likely continue spending down fund balance, but again, at a significantly slower rate than we have in the past year or two. And again, looking for some targeted fee increases there. And again, just looking at places where we're not really recovering costs. And again, also trying to sort of be mindful of some of our comparator jurisdictions as well. In building, we're not requesting any external funding subsidy. Most building departments do run without external funding support, and they really are a fee for service organization primarily. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier too, we have acknowledged that this is an issue that we need to tackle, and so we're proposing to initiate an assessment for both the current planning and the building services funds and work groups, and really thinking about what are the appropriate services and service levels that we can provide as a county, say, versus a city. Thinking about what are mandatory services, things that we have to do versus more desirable services that we want to offer or have offered in the past. And we'll evaluate and look at other jurisdictions and just sort of see where we fit within that spectrum, let's say. As I mentioned, there's been a change in the types of development that we're seeing, and we need to think about what our future development capacity within the unincorporated areas really looks like. So because of decisions that were made around the urbanization forum, there won't be any new big greenfield urban growth boundary expansions coming into urban unincorporated areas. And that's a good thing, but that does have implications obviously on our workload and the kinds of work that we'll be doing in the future. We obviously want to look at our process and our technology, and are there things that we can do to try to help enhance our delivery of services and do that more efficiently, more effectively, hopefully reducing costs, and just really thinking about how we meet the 21st century, right? I mean, we're well into it now, and want to make sure that we're providing the best possible services that we can. And then as we determine what are the appropriate services or service levels, then obviously there are staffing needs associated with those. So thinking about what that looks like, and then other potential sort of technology needs that may come with that. And then really just thinking about what are more sustainable, perhaps ongoing ways to continue to fund the services. And so in current planning, many agencies do subsidize that function in their agencies with some sort of external funding support. And then there may be other service delivery models that we can evaluate as well going forward. Next slide, please. So in that process, obviously, we want to engage some of our key stakeholders in that process. That includes you all at the board, and really getting your input on what are those appropriate service levels for our organization, and thoughts about any other service delivery opportunities or concerns that you may have, just things that will help us and inform a robust assessment. We'll be looking at other jurisdictions and talking with them about sort of the services they provide, how they provide them, how they fund that work, and then just looking for ideas and systems that seem to work well in other agencies that we could potentially incorporate into our practice and process. And then we need to talk to our developers and builder representatives. So again, we have a lot of what we call sort of mom and pop developers, those individual property owners that may come in and see us one time. And then we have sort of a range of professional developers and builders, and then the consultant community that works with them. Next slide. So for current planning and building, our next steps are we'll continue refining a scope for the assessment. We anticipate the adoption, obviously, of the upcoming budget in June, and then we'll start the assessment work, do that hopefully June through November, and that completed assessment then will help us inform our budget preparation for the upcoming fiscal year 22-23 and ongoing. I don't know if this is a spot where we want to pause and just absorb what we've seen so far, or would you rather that I just kind of head on through the rest of the items? It's a relatively short section here after this. Maybe I'll just keep going. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. So we want to take a quick look at the long-range planning function. So also part of Andy's division, planning and development services. And so these work groups, go ahead and go to the next slide. That consists really of two groups. Sorry, next slide. Community planning and transportation planning. So their functions are maintaining and updating our comprehensive plan documents. So we have the urban framework plan and a rural natural resource plan that govern the urban unincorporated areas and the rural area, respectively. Within the urban and rural areas, we have a community development code that regulates how development happens. And then in the urban areas, we have community plans that are sort of geographically based, and they establish the land use districts or the zoning, if you will, and some development criteria. And then we have a transportation plan, and that really applies countywide. These work groups, community planning processes, land use ordinances, and plan amendments. We do a lot of work within these groups at the local, regional, and state level, just coordinating all of our planning functions consistent with our state planning goals. And this group is pretty close to budgeted FTE. We're just a little bit, one position below our budgeted FTE here. Next slide, please. So in community planning specifically, the revenue sources are video lottery. We seek out grants and have been pretty successful getting grants for planning studies. And then we do receive general fund subsidy that makes up the difference between sort of the budgeted amount and the revenues from the other two sources. We mentioned back in October, video lottery had dropped off really substantially after the initial COVID-related shutdown, but has come back very strong. And according to our CFO, Jack Leong, we're anticipating strong video lottery revenues into the next year. So impacts have been pretty limited in this work group. Next slide, please. The Road Fund. So the Road Fund supports a lot of our programs across the department, and it's road related, obviously, that's right there in the name. These funds are generally statutorily limited to use related to roads, and the revenue sources that fund the Road Fund are the state and the county gas taxes, state and county vehicle registration fees. We get a little piece of state driver's license fees, and we also receive funding from the state for what's called the weight mile tax. So that's how large trucks pay for their impacts on the transportation system. Across the department, we have about 230 positions that are housed in the Road Fund budget. And again, our current FTE is 203, so about 13% below. And that's more consistent with our department-wide average because this is a much bigger work group. Next slide, please. So again, we covered this back in October. Revenues really dropped, obviously, sharply after the Stay Home, Save Lives order. Driving, dropped way off, and DMVs and the DEQ offices were all shut down for a period of time. So people weren't driving, weren't buying gas, couldn't get their vehicles registered, weren't buying a lot of vehicles, couldn't renew their driver's licenses. So all of those different revenue sources were being impacted at one time. However, the good news is that as things have gradually sort of reopened and we've sort of grown into what feels like a little bit of a new normal for now, revenues have come back up. So for our current budget year, our revenue projection is about $5 million below our budgeted target, and we've been mitigating that primarily through vacancy management. And we've made a few targeted spending reductions, but it's been a pretty manageable impact. And a piece of good news is that we have heard that we'll be receiving $2.7 million from ODOT in federal funds that are passing through, and those funds are meant to help offset lost revenues and things like the Road Fund. So that actually will be a huge support for us. And our fiscal year 21-22 revenues, as we're projecting forward, are pretty similar to our pre-COVID levels. So we've really seen driving activities come back up. We expect that there may be some additional driving that will happen as reopenings continue. Schools are set to reopen later in the spring here, and more people we anticipate may be returning to work on a more regular basis. There is, just as a footnote here, there are long-term, obviously, concerns about the sustainability of a gas tax, right, as we continue to move toward higher efficiency vehicles. And so Oregon's done a lot of work on a vehicle miles traveled system, and I think obviously that's the future, and it sounds like that's catching on at the federal level as well. But for now, we're primarily reliant on the gas tax revenues. Next slide. So the Major Streets Transportation Improvement Program, MSTIP, and the Urban Road Maintenance District, those are both really property tax based. And so because of the crazy property tax system that we have in Oregon, those revenues have not been impacted, and we actually can anticipate continuing to see some growth in assessed value, which results in growth in property tax revenues. So according to our CFO, again, we're looking at about a 4% projected growth in AV for the next budget year, although there is anticipated to be some gradual slowing of that rate of growth in assessed value over time. So we'll obviously be watching that along with the finance folks and county administrative office. Next slide. I think that's it. So we'll open it up if you have any questions or comments, and thank you for your time. Oh,
you're on mute, Chair.
So commissioners, I just want to call your attention to the 2 questions that are on the topic sheet, in addition to any questions you may have on any of the information as presented. For your benefit, I'll read the questions. The first one: does the board support the approach outlined to address anticipated gaps between revenues and expenditures in current planning and building services? The second question is, does the board have any questions or concerns for staff to keep in mind moving forward? And that particular question, I think, pertains to the fact that under the purpose and desired outcomes section, they were seeking our input on 2 specific items. The proposed budget business, which relates to question 1, but also for the study of services. So, commissioners, do you have any general questions or answers for those 2 questions as posed by staff?
Can I go ahead? So thank you, Stephen. This isn't obviously the first time that we've gone through this presentation, and I think I'd like to fast forward, if I could, to the building services. Which one was it that you were proposing $1 million of increased fees?
Yeah, that's building services. It's slide 14 if you'd like to have that put back on.
Yeah, no, I've got it here on my computer. I can do that. You can put it back up too, I guess. I'm getting to there, just a second. So if you could, I mean, all of our accounts have reserve fund balances that we like to maintain, sustain, obviously. Could you give me a little bit of an explanation as to, in the current planning, under building services, we've got a $9 million fund balance. So what's the philosophy behind needing a $9 million fund reserve? And I'm going to ask the same question on the one right above that, where we have $1 million fund balance. And I'm not advocating that we spend that down any further or anything else. I just need to understand the concept behind having that balance.
Sure. Yeah, it's a couple of things really drive that. There's no magic to that particular number, and so you can see we're proposing to spend the fund balance down further this year, another $1 million. Again, based on our best guess assumptions at this point. But you know, we have a fund balance again that helps us to sort of weather short downturns, right? So we have been drawing on that fund balance significantly over the last few years. That's also had built up too because we were budgeting for some significant technology upgrades that have launched. So we've expended the bulk of the funds that we need to expend on those, but we do have some ongoing costs associated with those going forward. And we're implementing a new technology system right now that will enable video inspection services. So we continue to have some technology needs. And I think the final thing I would just say, I think that there's an expectation sometimes that in the event of a big earthquake or something, we may be called upon to put a lot of our staff to work helping assist with building assessments throughout the county. And so we anticipate the need to have some reserve funds on hand to be able to initiate that work, some of which hopefully or much of which might eventually be reimbursed either by the state or the federal agencies that support emergency response, but we may have some initial costs that we would need to try to absorb.
Okay.
If I could just clarify that to make sure I understand what you just said in response to Commissioner Willie's question. So I hear that, you know, you've needed to cover additional technology investment and this reserve for earthquakes. Is that to the tune of approximately 9 million? Or how has that been scoped for this ongoing fund reserve balance?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, there isn't really any magic to the specific number, and so you know we think that continuing to spend that fund balance down is not unreasonable. We just feel that we need to start doing that at a slower rate. But yeah, to your specific question of have we tried to establish a minimum necessary fund balance? We have not really gone through that exercise in a concrete way.
Okay. Well, so just let me, and again, I'm not sure what I'm saying is what I believe. So anyway, so we're talking about a targeted fee increase of $1 million. What is that? And we have revenue of 7.6. According to this, that's what you're projecting for the next fiscal year is a 7.6. So that would be basically, I don't know, is that a 15% increase? Is that what we're talking about?
That's a good question. Do some math here really quickly.
And I guess maybe 13%. Yeah. And so maybe I could have that because I can, you know, me and numbers, I get a little bit deep in the weeds and I apologize for that. Here's my thoughts on this. I would much prefer to see, I guess, a plan where we identify, as you've called it out, what our future needs are going to look like, what's our future services look like. You and I've had this conversation before, looking out on unincorporated Washington County and seeing what our opportunity for larger projects, and you and I talked about a couple of those. But overall, I'd like to see a better snapshot of what these departments look like rolling out with our best guess, realizing this would be a hard thing to do, but with our best guess of what this looks like, because that would then give me comfort to say, I want to take this, I'm okay with moving this fund balance down further over the next year or two, because again, when we talk about a burn rate in a department for determining what our reserves are, we talk about 90 days, 180 days. But in this particular case, we're talking about almost a year of reserves to cover our expenditures, you know, with our expenditures being 10.6 million and our reserve being 9 million. I mean, and so I'm kind of talking out loud here, but I'm thinking out loud. I am not, as we had this conversation a year ago when we wanted to slow down the fees. I do not want to impact the department. I'm more concerned about we're reducing staff while at the same time maybe our workflow stays about the same. So that just means the remaining staff have more work. And generally that's not a sustainable process. So I'd much prefer to see, I guess, a little bit different perspective than certainly than reducing staff and by increasing fees. Those two I'd like to have us have, I guess, a different conversation on for both of these departments. And I apologize honestly, because you and Andy have done a lot of work on this. And I know that you guys are trying to find the happy spot. And I don't feel like we're there yet, but I do want to tell you how much I appreciate the hard work that you've done on this to try and protect our staff and also protect the integrity of these departments and the service model that I know that we have to meet for our public. So there's a lot of balancing, a lot of marbles we got to keep on the table there. But I guess I'd like to consider a little bit further conversation on this.
Commissioner Treese?
Could I ask Commissioner Willie a question? So, Commissioner Willie, are you then advocating for a larger spend down in that reserve balance? That's what I'm hearing you say. Or
I would like to
see what it looks like.
I would like to look at that. Yes, again, because,
Okay.
and it's just like we talk about. I'm holding on to the fact that we need a $15 million reserve in our general fund. I understand why that is. I mean, we start burning down that rate from July 1 until we start collecting tax dollars. I get that. Okay. But this doesn't look like it follows that same methodology. And so I just want to understand this better. Again, I am a huge fan of reserves and think that certainly speaks of the health of the organization. But I don't know when enough is enough. And that's all I'm advocating.
Okay, thank you. And I would just like to second Commissioner Willie's comments and include Sheila in those comments too, that I know you all have worked extremely hard, and this is an issue of threading a needle and trying to figure out where you can best be a predictor of the future and meet the needs. So, and I appreciate the outreach you've made to our community as well. So, but that said, I support what Commissioner Willie's saying, that we need that understanding of the reserve and what it's, what our expectations are, not just historically, but how do we best utilize it moving forward, I think is an important piece.
Other commissioners?
Yeah, I'll make some comments. Much the same, but maybe Pam and Jerry made, only a different slant entirely. And because I come from a very different background, and that's that Stephen and Andy, we've all been briefed. I appreciate the work, and it's a lot of work, a lot of assumptions. We don't know how the hydraulics of this will all work in the future. We're guessing. If our reserves are too high, we need to bring them down. I agree to all of that. That's really not an issue. The really big issue in all of this is a systemic issue of how do we provide these services in the future on an ongoing basis with the model we have. And why I say I might come from a different viewpoint is that I appreciate departments providing information, but with all due respect, I'd like an administrative response as to what they think are the courses of solution. And I can think of solutions. One of them would be, you do the layoffs and you right size yourself. That's not something I would advocate and would hope we never get to, but that's a solution. Another solution is we go out and we continue to ask for more dollars from the community members. And I think that's not a very popular idea right now. at least from people I talk to. A third option would be to sit there, look and say, okay, we never anticipated, those of us who've been on for a while, the employee growth rate throughout the county. So we were living on some reserves that we had. I'm not saying those growth rates are bad. It's just change and evolution. But having said that, we can't simply say that the general fund doesn't support some of your activities. We're a complete outlier with other jurisdictions. They all subsidize some of the common activities we do, meaning that, some code enforcement, some planning for small projects. There's a number of things that governments do out of their general fund because they think it's a general service. So we need to take a look at that. And another model would be to say, well, is there any synergy with other jurisdictions? For instance, and I spoke about that at the forum on Saturday. Nobody likes to use the A word of annexation, but it's on the table. Should we be looking and saying, how do we best cooperate with other jurisdictions to maybe offload some of these things we can't do? They're not going to take losers. I mean, that's not what they do unless they get the property through annexation, meaning that they're not going to say, I'll take all of your work, but I'm not going to get paid. They'll want the profit margins in for their general services. So it's a much bigger question. I mean, you're the canary in the coal mine, Stephen. You really are. It's going to happen throughout the organization. We've heard the 2% reduction next year, another 2%. I mean, what's the deep dive? So I again, with Tanya, with no disrespect at all, because I think your staff's doing great and it's good information. I would like to see some kind of administrative chewing on this to say, okay, what are the alternatives? Not just in this one, but in other departments, and where do we go from here?
Thank you, Commissioner Rogers. Commissioner Fye?
Tanya, did you want to respond to? I saw you unmute yourself.
Thanks, Commissioner Fye. I could have waited. So Commissioner Rogers, in response to your inquiry about, in essence, what's the future service delivery methodology and revenue source, that is the key part of the assessment. And to be honest, that's where my focus area has been, working with Stephen, because there's the short term and the long term, and we need to have our focus on what is the long term, because looking back in history, we've been at this point before an LUT. So it's time to really look at it systematically and how we should be structuring ourselves. So just wanted to share that perspective.
I think for me, as the most freshman board member, and also a member who just got the briefing on this topic recently, I think like a week ago or so, I support your approach, Stephen. And I think it's also important, the concern about the reservation, the reserve money, because when I heard from the business community, especially the developers and their lobbyists, and some of the concern they had was the supplies of homes. And so that was really a concern and how we're down to 2 weeks worth. And they brought that concern to make the point about staff layoff and how that would impact, and how the experience and the level of expertise that we will lose if we were to lay off. So I think it's a good, it's interesting that we consider the reserve conversation, because if we don't have to lose some of that expertise on staff, then it might be an opportunity to keep our business community happy while also maintaining our staff and not laying off people as we are coming off of a pandemic. So those are my comment, I guess, to express support. And then in terms of questions or concerns to keep in mind, I think as you do the study I like to be engaged. To just, I'm sure you're gonna keep our diversity and equity office included in that, to just have an equity approach applied to the lens to so that we're looking who's advantaged, who's disadvantaged in our services when it comes to land use and transportation, or in particular building services or planning services.
Thank you, Commissioner Fye. I'll go next. So I have a quick question on the memo on page 2. You talked about how permitting and inspection services under building services is provided for several cities in Washington County. Who might they be?
We provide full permitting services for Banks, Gaston, and North Plains.
Yep.
And I'm going to look to Andy. I believe Sherwood and Tualatin, and there may be
Sherwood and Tualatin and Forest Grove. We do electrical, I believe. In Sherwood, we do plumbing also, I believe.
Thank you. Okay, so to the two approaches on building services, I share the concern with regard to carrying such a large fund balance and not putting that into action sooner. I mean, this is a bad year, right? So I think targeting just over $1 million for that spend down is and increasing services. I think you really should look at spending that down the just over $2 million and not having the fee increased as you talked about. I'd like to look at that. I'd like to see what that means. I didn't go back and look at the prior presentations to look at the graphs of the trend lines and all of that. It just seems like $9 million is a pretty high level of fund balance carrying just for that one segment. Particularly given the annual expenditures. Then on current planning, I understand that you're asking for an additional subsidy. So that would take the total subsidy that we might see in the proposed budget to $685,000 total. I assume that the CAO will put that in the proposed budget. I might support that as a one-time, but I'm not committing to that at this point. It's like, okay, put it in the proposed budget and let's see the impacts. We have worse impacts in other areas of the agency. But I understand the immediate concern and your proposal for next steps of doing an assessment. So for that assessment, I would like to see a clearer definition of what in current planning must be done for each of these categories, for rural versus the contracted cities versus for urban unincorporated Washington County. I just think we need some clarity on that. Also, I think for looking at how other counties handle the rural part of that, please take a look at what Lane, Marion, and Yamhill counties do as well. We do have some sister jurisdictions. Then also in terms of doing an assessment, I think we might have to, if we're going to do a comprehensive assessment, we we might, or you might consider saying, well, if we don't provide it, who amongst our partner jurisdictions might? And, going back to that, whatever that phrase was for the urban services agreement, look at the 3 main adjacent cities for these UUA areas of Tigard, Hillsborough, and Beaverton, and see, if we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, what is it going to mean to contract with those jurisdictions? Certainly we see that Multnomah County contracts with the city of Portland for the bulk of their land use planning. Then I'm a little unclear if this assessment applies to only building services and current planning or to the whole shooting match. So for example, I went to slide 19, where you talk about long-range planning, snapshot, community planning, and transportation planning. And, you talk about rural and the urban framework plan. We've got, different geographic needs, right? I know that going back to the legislature in 2005, the county doesn't have to keep up community plans. But I don't know what that means, a la being part of Metro. If we end up having to do some work because of new changes they make or not. So, I really need some clarity there. I'd rather speak with further information, much like, Commissioner Willie wants to make sure he's got eyes wide open and can speak from that good data. So I'm a little skeptical that you can do all of that information gathering and assessment within 6 months. But I think knock yourselves out, go through that assessment, and then have some board briefings and see where it falls short in terms of information needs we may have or not. But I think you're also going to need to have a clearer definition of what it is you're assessing.
Yeah, and I'll just speak to that very briefly. The intent was really focused on current planning and building services. Those are the ones where we seem to have this sort of recurring issue that comes up, and wanted to focus that attention. However, I think your point is well taken, that we may take a look at some aspects of our sort of long-range planning work as well, because there is some interrelationship between current planning and long-range planning.
Well, and I understand the source of funding for long-range planning, but I also know that those are discretionary revenues. And we keep falling further and further behind in addressing community need in other aspects of the agency. And now may be a good time for us to or sometime, as part of the strategic plan, we're going to need just a lot more information about what it means for us to be providing these services. So I understand your point. Will we need it for the proposed budget next year? No, I'm not saying that at all. But I do think we're going to have to take a comprehensive big look at all of this. And I want to make sure that we have the benefit of information around that. That's all. So what part are you doing sooner rather than someday we'll do?
Right. Okay.
I don't want to say later, because it's not like, I'm asking you to put a stake in the ground, commit.
Great. Thank you.
Did I address all of your questions?
I think so. I think we have some direction moving forward. We'll take an additional look at our fund balance, the fund balance questions, and report back to you as soon as we can do that. And We'll modify our assessment scope based on the feedback that we received, and we'll reshare that with you all just to make sure that we feel like we're on the right track. And did I miss anything there?
I think we may have provided it previously, but we can provide more information on fees and how we compare to other jurisdictions, because I know that seemed to be behind some of the questions, just so you get a sense of where we're at. And I also want to point out that, I mean, the last 10 years has been really interesting, having the growth at Nike, and Nike has certainly provided a ton of money to building services. And they've got a lot of work out of us too, but I think that their expansion has been kind of a unique thing that has really added a lot to our fund balance. So it would be great if there was another one of those on the horizon, but we don't see it.
Well, thank you for having eyes wide open on that. Go ahead, Commissioner. I'm sorry.
Andy, one more thing, and that I know, Tanya, you're going to look at the more systemic issues that I talked about over long term, but short term, there really are two services that, and I know you provide a lot of funds, a lot of different things. One of them is proprietary funds, more where you're charging a fee for a service, and I understand that. Others are general fund support. How do we compare with other jurisdictions? Because I think we're an outlier. How do we compare with other counties and other cities in terms of what the general fund subsidy for things such as, neighborhood planning that we do in unincorporated, such as code enforcement, such as other issues that would be, as you say, customer service issues that nobody's paying anything for, but they kind of would like the answer. So how do we compare? Because I think that's a key to what we need to internally look at. So I'd appreciate seeing that information.
Yeah, that'll definitely be a part of the assessment. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, if I could, Roy, just to jump on that too, I've done a little bit of homework on some of these things. And I was reminded that the cities get to enjoy things like franchise fees and right-of-way fees. And that's how their departments are supported. And we don't have either of those.
And business license fees.
So yeah, we are operating on the short end of the stick on this a little bit. So we got to take that into consideration as well.
You're right. So if some of those UUAs were to become part of cities, then that funding would be distributed differently so that cities would have more resources to do the work for those areas.
I just make comment, you're absolutely correct. And we used to factor that in and say, well, that was part of the reason for our planning way back when, in terms of what our strategic plan, saying that cities are the best provider of those services because they get the revenues we don't. And at one time, Stephen can correct me, but it's before his time, I think, if we had everything unincorporated in the city right now, it's millions and millions and millions of dollars of gas tax revenue in excess of what we're getting, that we could probably maintain all the roads with just the additional amounts of money we'd get out of the state pool, which now goes to other cities because we're not included. So I'm not saying we incorporate everything tomorrow. That's not it at all. But I think it's a thoughtful approach to looking at it. So I agree with you, Jerry. You're absolutely right.
Yep, I'm right there with you. Okay, so it sounds like you've summarized the work ahead, and we'll go from there.
Great. Thank you all for your time.
All righty. Thank you very much. Darn, I meant to, sorry to interrupt. I meant to say, Mr. Beck, I do recall that you've provided previously that information, but what I didn't have easy at my fingertips is at what work session we went over that information, so I could have navigated back. So I do appreciate that you've done that work. I just needed a couple more breadcrumbs to remind myself. That's all. So that's, I really want you to know that's where those pointers really do help, because I don't mind going back and taking a look in the archive. It's easily available. So
All right. Thank you.
Thank you
October
very much.
27th, if just FYI. Yeah.
it was what, the 27th?
October.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good point. I thought I had mentioned that, but apparently we didn't. So
It's okay.
thanks.
Okay. Well, onward ho we go. Thank you for presenting a challenging topic to us and making sure we're mindful of all the challenges and difficulty that you're navigating. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So Chair Harrington, just to let you know, on the schedule, we are scheduled to have an executive session starting at 11:30, but we have the audit committee bylaws by Jack Liang first. So just bring that to your attention.
So I was going to ask Ms. Angie what her recommendation is.
My recommendation is that we go into executive session and then move the bylaws to the first item in the afternoon.
Great. So do we have a motion to move to executive session pursuant to ORS 192.660 sub 2 and ORS 192.501 sub 18 and sub 23?
So moved.
Do we have a second? We have a second from Commissioner Willie. All those in favor, please vote by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? The motion carries unanimously, 5-0. Boom, we're hereby in executive session.
Madam Chair, we scheduled a separate